Hello, welcome to AT&T ThreatTraq for February 24th, 2015. This program provides network security highlights, discussion, and countermeasures for cyber threats. Today we're joined by Chester Wisniewski. Chester is the Senior Security Advisor at Sophos Canada. And Chester, if you don't mind, can you tell us a little about what you do?
Sure. I've got a pretty sweet job, to be honest. I get to kind of use Sophos Labs, our research arm of the company, to find interesting things to look into that are, from the perspective of the malware ecosystem. And then after doing a lot of research and working with my colleagues on figuring out how it works, I fly around the world and tell everybody about it.
Oh, cool. I think I can reflect on that one a little bit. So welcome to the program. Glad to have you here. And we have Jim Clausing online as well. Welcome, Jim.
Hey.
An enthusiastic welcome. And in the studio here, we have Matt Kaiser. Welcome, Matt.
How's it going?
And Stan Nurilov. Welcome back, Stan.
Thank you.
2 weeks in a row, right?
Yes.
All right. Great. And I'm Brian Rexroad, and let's get right into it here. First, Stan, why don't we go to you? And, there's no shortage of exploit kits, and so we've got some new ones coming out. This one has a little bit, some special features associated with it, right?
Yes, I think, to start, the guys at TrustWave did a pretty good analysis of the RIG exploit kit. I guess some source code was leaked, and they did an analysis. They have a lot of detail on their blog entry online. But some things that stood out for me is the architecture of it. As security researchers, we usually only get to see the high level or the first step where the victim meets the exploit kit, so to speak. But there's apparently this whole other set of things in the back end that the guys use to make sure they keep their hosting up and lets them continue staying up. So it's an interesting article, and I like how they go into the architecture of it, because I think most people probably don't understand how it works. There's a lot of advanced features that they support in order to continue helping themselves stay up and keep their hosting. They even, probably standing behind some servers that are legitimate, like I think Cloudflare or something like that, which is a legitimate hosting provider, but allows things like this, which might be illegitimate, to continue having hosting. And another thing that they did is, this RIG exploit kit, it actually separates the privileges of the different components of the exploit kit. For example, there's a customer management interface. That's one server. There's the server that has all the exploits on it. That's another component in the architecture. And then there is a set of compromised machines that they use to actually redirect people. And those servers that host the exploit kits, that's yet another component. So by keeping everything separated like that, they're probably able to make sure that security researchers kind of don't have all of the components all in one place to be able to tag them down easily. So a very interesting article. They also showed some of the, how the guys are structured, how the operators of the exploit kit are structured. And based on some of their rough calculations, they think this exploit brings their operators about $90,000 a week or something like that.
Wow.
So, those are rough estimates. It may not be accurate, but it's just something, something interesting to note.
Right. Now, is there any speculation on how many people might be behind that?
I don't think I saw that in the article.
Okay. That's always sort of an interesting topic from my point of view. Something, again, you don't really see the back-end infrastructure associated with it, but when you consider the complexity of some of the tools that are out there and how they have to basically divvy up whatever, maliciously gained revenue, how much they're really making in the end. There have certainly been some cases where it looks like it's been sort of lucrative for the attackers, but there's also a growing amount of risk associated with that end of the business as well.
Right, and I think they're really trying to cater to make it simpler for people. So as a customer of the RIG exploit kit, you'd just be exposed to the customer-facing website, and you can upload your malicious software, and everything happens in the background for you. Really all the obfuscation of the malware and delivery to the victims, that all happens behind the scenes. I think for $160 a week, is what they quoted, you can have something like that. And I think they said it's about 10 to 15% infection rate. So of all the people coming through, exploits work 10 to 15% of the time. So it's pretty significant, depending on how many compromised servers they have out there, and what the flow through rate is. They also mentioned, you said about numbers, how many customers they have, and there's several hundred customers that the researchers at TrustWave were able to pin down. So I don't know how many bad guys there really are, but the number of customers they have is in the hundreds.
Okay. This is somewhat tangential, but when you said about the infrastructure and the back end portion of it, it reminded me of, having been tracking botnet activity and the evolution of that. One of the sort of fundamental concepts that at least I have seen is that there really is very little revolution in attack capabilities. The techniques are really just, incremental changes, improvements from sort of a malicious point of view to try to deal with the problems that they're running into along the way. And I remember back when a botnet may have consisted of, 2 IRC controllers, and they were overcoming things like, well, IRC is not all that scalable. You have to have some other way of managing it, and it's it became very volatile in that they'd knock down an IP address, and so it would take down the botnet, and so they started using more and more controllers. Well, then you have a new kind of management problem, and then they went to P2P networks and deliberately spreading them across different international boundaries so that it would slow down the process of trying to implement blocks. So interesting how the back-end infrastructure has evolved over time, but it is very much an evolution. That's one of the things that I think is very valuable about doing threat analysis, is that you can, once you've learned the history, you actually can predict a little bit about what the technology might go to in the next phase.
Well, I think one of the interesting things to me was just this using of proxies to disguise the location of the exploits and the malicious code itself, and that one of the more successful techniques we have for blocking these things and protecting people from getting victimized is that there's not a lot of hosts out there that are willing to intentionally host exploits and payloads. So there's sort of this known malware destination type thing going on out there that can help web filters, antivirus, etc. block a lot of these things. And by having this kind of fast rotating proxy service, that really that obfuscation really complicates the detection method, meaning you have to now detect the code itself. You can't just detect the reputation where it's coming from.
Absolutely. So that from an internet service provider point of view, it's certainly more complicated. From a observer's point of view, it's certainly more complicated. One of the things, and I think you're kind of hedging on this, that is, as a cloud service provider, as a hosting provider, I think there's fundamentally a responsibility to be paying attention to how the service is being used. That is, if you're selling a service that's ultimately being used for a malicious purpose, it's almost a contributor to the activity. And so, not that it's easy, but there's still appears to be, at least in my opinion, some level of responsibility of the service provider to understand how those services are being used. Thanks, Dan. That was a good discussion there. And you were alluding to some of this activity being hosted in the back. I guess, Chat, you've done a little bit of study on servers that may be helping to facilitate exploits. Do you have any comments?
Yeah, I did some interesting research. There was a conference in Los Angeles this weekend called the Southern California Linux Expo, and they asked me to come and talk about some Linux security stuff. And it's not something we focus on all that much because most of the, we're looking at all these exploits. While an exploit may work, say, on Flash for OS 10 and Linux as well as Windows, the way we see the the criminals typically weaponize this stuff, it's almost always focused on the Windows victims. So I started poking around and saying, well, what role or what role does Linux play in this malware ecosystem, right? We know most of the web hosting infrastructure out there is running on some sort of a Unix or a Linux-based system, and I wanted to kind of compare, say, to the Netcraft data just to see what kind of trends we might see. And there was some really interesting bits that came out of it. I mean, it looks like from my research, which is I took 1 week's worth of malicious URLs from our lab, which was about 178,000 malicious URLs that we cataloged in 1 week from February 1 to February 6. And then I went and cataloged each one, like, what CMS might they be running, what web server might they be running, that kind of thing. And it was 79.9% of them were running either Unix or Linux that were hosting the exploit kits, the payloads, the infected blogs, the malicious redirects, the JavaScript, etc. And surprisingly, there were some interesting bits around servers that are compromised to direct victims to bad things had different characteristics quite dramatically than servers that were intentionally hosting bad things and waiting for victims to be directed there. So going back to the rig, discussion we just had, you would see the infected blog that's legitimate, that's directing traffic, and those 16% more of them were running Apache than any other web server. Whereas when we look at servers that were hosting the malicious payload, perhaps the banking Trojan or the keylogger or whatever they're trying to install in the end, those servers had a propensity to run Nginx more than other web servers. So I haven't really fully analyzed the data to get all the details out of it yet, because it's quite a treasure trove of stuff I collected, but some interesting trends are emerging.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what we've seen in the past, in terms of the Internet Weather Report, there have been a number of cases where we've seen actually searching around. It was a Tomcat server, for example, weak passwords, and so perhaps one of the vectors that are being used to actually get to these Apache web servers and to be able to host the malicious payload. Stan's nodding.
Yeah, a large portion of them were running cPanel as well. Now, I don't know that cPanel was the way they necessarily got in, but we did see worms exploiting the shell shock vulnerability that were targeting cPanel, so that might be one of the reasons.
Yep.
Did you gather statistics on WordPress, Joomla, the other common CMSs? Because I have a feeling those would be pretty well represented as well.
Yeah, that was harder to do. I don't have numbers that I'm scientifically comfortable with yet. I did look at those and saw that it was a very small number of Drupal and seemingly equivalent numbers of Joomla and WordPress sites that are part of the attack chain, and again, much heavier on the infected sites side than the hosting sites side.
Yep, that's what I'd expect.
I'll be publishing the data over the next few weeks, and once I've got some anomalies in the data, and I just want to check with my colleagues and make sure that they're actually interesting anomalies and not me screwing up the statistics. So once I have colleague verification that I haven't made any errors, I'll be publishing it all on our blog and sharing it so that other people can dig through it as well.
Oh, great. Thank you, Chet. It sounds like a prudent exercise to make sure that your statistics are good, and we're definitely looking forward to seeing what gets published here. Very interesting study there. And anytime you ever get an infection, the first thing you should do to try to get rid of it or get it under control is shut it off. Shut off the machine, right, Jim?
Yeah, well, with my forensic hat on, I don't want you powering it off until I get a chance to take a look at it. But
Okay.
AVG had an interesting blog post this past week about a newly discovered Android malware sample that they were seeing mostly in China, and relatively few infected devices as of the time they wrote it up. But it was had some interesting characteristics. They call it Android power off hijack. And basically what this malware does is it hijacks the power off process. So when you hit the power button and tell your Android device to shut down, it goes through a series of steps. It turns the radios off. It sends the shutdown command. It blanks the screen. Whatever all it does. Well, this malware intercepts some of that, and what it'll do is it'll blank the screen and turn the sound off so that the user believes that the system is shut off, but it will continue to operate. So it'll continue to have the ability to make and receive phone calls that the user doesn't know anything about, to send and receive SMS messages, to record audio, to record video, take pictures, and ship all of this off to the bad guys. And the only way that the user would necessarily know that this happened is that the battery would actually be drained a little more quickly than you'd expect if the thing was completely powered off. It does require getting root permissions. So if you have not rooted your phone, then then this probably isn't going to work unless somebody else adapts this and finds some privilege escalation exploit that I'm not familiar with at the moment. So, so if you haven't rooted your phone, if you're not going to Chinese app stores, at the moment you're probably okay. But Tim Strazier from Lookout was commenting in a mailing list that I'm on with him that that while this is one of the first times that we've seen this technique used, it isn't the absolute first time. Something similar was done by the BigServe.A malware a few years ago in one of the infected Droid Dream cleaners, something that claimed to clean up a Droid Dream infection, an app that claimed to clean up the Droid Dream infection, actually used some similar techniques. So yeah, I like the first paragraph of the AVG blog post. So, they're talking about in Hollywood movies we see the hackers, that can turn on the mobile devices or track you even when the thing is turned off, and that's fiction. But this particular malware, it makes the user believe that it's turned off. So.
Well, in our labs, we see like 3,000 some odd Android samples coming in every single day, and yet almost every single one of them, again, requires that you've gone off market, right? So, like you said, not all of them require root like this one does, but if your enterprise mobility management tool lets you say, don't allow rooted devices and, don't allow users to untick that or tick that checkbox that says, allow off-market applications, you largely avoid most of the malware problem.
Yep, absolutely.
And we've been saying that over and over again. So, Jim, any indications specifically where this malware was hosted?
It doesn't say, but it is in China. I mean, if you look through some of the code, some of the comments and some of the log stuff is in Chinese. So it appears to have been primarily targeted at the Chinese to this point, and hosted in Chinese third-party markets. And
any indications of the motivation behind it, what the purpose might be?
The malware has the ability to do a lot of things. It does all the nasty things that the bad guys like to do on the mobile devices.
Yeah. Okay. Probably not keep your apps up to date, however, right?
No.
So, the thing that came to mind, and you mentioned send and receive SMS. I was wondering if they'd found any filters to intercept, to facilitate, bypassing the two-factor authentication or using an SMS as a back channel. Technically, I don't really think of that as as a two-factor authentication, but at least it's it's sort of a back channel path that unfortunately through means like this can be intercepted. So better, but probably not the best way to do strong authentication. All right, very good, Jim. That's we'll have to keep an eye on this type of thing. And then, by the way, I presume that a hard shutdown would bypass this. Is that correct?
Well, that's not entirely clear. It should. One of the things that they suggested was actually pulling the battery, which is fine if you're using a device where you can get to the battery. These days, a lot of the devices, you can't get to the battery. My phone, I can't get to the battery. My tablet, I can't get to the battery. So,
Yep, it's becoming more and more the case. The batteries, the battery technology's improved a lot, so I think less and less they consider it to be a necessity. And if you run out of battery, you just kind of plug in another USB thing so you can get infected that way, right?
I think to help with that situation, just give your phone to your kids, let them watch some YouTube videos. It'll probably be dead in like 2 hours, so you can be sure.
Well, I mean, that's the thing, I guess. I mean, like giving somebody advice saying, hey, hard shut off. I mean, wouldn't the advice be get rid of the virus?
Good idea. Okay, so thank you, Jim. And Matt, let's go to you. And I guess, this is a pretty big story here. It needs no introduction. I'll let you go ahead
Let's
and
introduce it then. Superfish. If you've been on the internet this week, you've heard about it. So between September of last year and February of this year, Lenovo was shipping some of their laptops with software called Superfish, which was it was adware, and its purpose was to inject relevant advertising into web browser sessions based on your search terms. It turns out that in order to do this, it was playing some tricks with SSL and intercepting SSL at the browser. It was installing itself as a trusted root certificate, which means that it had the ability to, if any certificates were presented against the browser would check and say, do we know this guy? And it would say, yeah, Superfish, I'm here. You can trust anything that has my name on it.
So it's kind of like legitimizing that, browser in the middle, or man in the browser.
It is
attack,
exactly man in the middle. That is that for advertising purposes.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it turns out that their implementation had, let's just say, a few bugs. One of the problems with it is that the certificate itself that they were using could be extracted very trivially from memory. And Robert Graham actually demonstrated this, where he ran the software, found the certificate in memory, pulled it out, and then tried to sign his own cert with it and found out that, oh, look, it needs a password. Brute force the password. Turns out the password is and I don't think I'm giving anything away by saying that because it's all over the internet. Now, this is a terrible password. If you know anything about the DLL that's being used, this is a terrible password.
It at least didn't show up in Jim's list.
It will show up in Jim's list tomorrow.
Next time.
I promise you it
There will
will.
be a lot of guesses on it.
So the other problem with it is Filippo Lasorda, I hope I'm getting his name right, did some research around the implementation of SSL interception. And it turns out that you can actually trick this Superfish Commodia software into modifying non-legitimate SSL certificates in a way to make them appear legitimate. Now, I can go into the details. It has something to do with an extension to X509, the alternate name field, where if you put your target server name in there, it'll take a look at it and say, okay, well, thumbs up, it's in there somewhere, and it'll appear to be valid. This is terrible because anybody using a Lenovo laptop, not only are they, not only could somebody create their own certificate that these laptops will obey, they'll also be vulnerable to self-signed, unauthenticated certificates. So in general, this is kind of a huge mistake.
Really kind of, subverting the entire authentication intention behind SSL.
Basically shooting SSL in the foot for anybody with a laptop with this installed. Now, Lenovo has, after a little bit of resistance, apologized, provided ways for removing it, will not be installing it on future machines. Symantec, McAfee, Microsoft have all added this to their antivirus. This will be automatically removed, which is great. And Lenovo has published a list of laptops that are affected by this. So things are being fixed, but it turns out that this is not the only place where this software is actually available. The Commodia technology is in a couple other products. Some of them are legitimate-ish, some of them are straight up malware. And I think it's raising a lot of questions on SSL interception, the legitimacy, the right reasons to do it, the wrong reasons to do it. So now we've got this mess.
I think this is really a sort of a broader topic. A lot of folks have said it's kind of like the Wild West out there. I've been saying for years that there really are no rules on the internet. There are really guidelines. And it really has, I think, a lot to do with the transparency of the provider. And so to go into this a little bit further, there's a big effort to try to monetize access to internet and to provide users with the least expensive access to internet capabilities as possible, whether it be the PCs themselves, browser access, network service, you name it. They're trying to provide it as inexpensively as possible and to recoup whatever costs through advertising mechanisms. And so this is a case, in the way I see it, a case where they were trying to do what they felt to be a legitimate thing under the, there are no rules environment, but then perhaps overstepped or made some flaws in the implementation.
A lot of this all comes back to debates we were having 3 or 4 years ago when CA after CA were being compromised, DigiNotar and all this stuff that was going on, right? And we really, you can easily detect and prevent this type of stuff if we get beyond the current CA model. The convergence proposal by Moxie Marlinspike a few years ago, I know some Google researchers had some other proposals where you can verify from multiple, kind of triangulate what should an SSL certificate look like, right? Have a P2P network where somebody on Comcast and somebody on Shaw in Canada and then somebody, on their laptop at Starbucks all compare what cert did they get and see that one of these things is not like the other. We've been dragging our feet on technical solutions to email insecurities, certificate authorities, all these things for years.
Yeah, good point. And when you say we here, I think you're referring to basically the internet ecosystem in general.
Yeah, I'll blame Vint Cerf. Why not? No, but the big we of those of us that are in technical control of the internet.
Yeah.
Which is the people participating in standards committees, whether that's ICANN, whether that's AT&T as a service provider. We all play a role in this in moving standards forward, and Google's been doing a lot to move a lot of standards forward lately, and I think I'd like to see more large tech companies with influence get involved, saying enough is enough. Let's build a secure internet.
Yeah, I think the important thing in all of these is to try to recognize ulterior motives in those activities. That there's potentially a difference between trying to make a more secure internet and trying to protect your own business model for monetizing use of the internet. So there are some aspects of that need to be considered in that entire process. But I agree with you thoroughly that to try to push forward for improving the technology and in fact improving the assurances around that technology. That is, a lot of the problems that we're seeing aren't necessarily a lack of technology; they're just flaws in the implementation.
There are technological ways to defeat this particular thing. There was an article in the Register today that Mozilla is thinking of releasing a blacklist of dangerous root certificates that would include this one, and just would not accept the Superfish certificate at all. But there are deeper underlying issues in the whole infrastructure that like Chet was just saying.
Yeah. So the notion of revoked certificates it exists, but I think it sounds like, Jim, that this would be basically an independent blacklisting of certain certificates.
Yeah, that's what Mozilla is considering doing, and we've seen IE. Microsoft has done IE updates that removed certain root certificates in the past. Chrome and Firefox both have done something, have had similar updates in the past. So Mozilla's talking about putting that into a Firefox update probably. They said they could do it within 24 hours.
Well, and this comes back to the standards being horribly, horribly broken again, which is, in order to have a certificate system work, the original design required this concept of revocation. And then Google completely removed revocation checking from Chrome almost a year ago. So you can't even turn it on. There's no way to know if a certificate's been revoked. The only way you can even limp forward, if we want to call it that, is with this blacklisting concept, right? So the whole certificate thing is, just broken, right? Because the basic premises and concepts that we trust everyone issuing certificates, and if we screw up, we can undo it with a revocation. Both of those things are fundamentally broken.
Yep, absolutely. But again, good principles in terms of paying attention to what you're buying or not. Let's take a look at the internet weather for the last week or so here. The first item that worth showing to you here is actually scam probes on port 11.2.11 TCP. Again, this is that memcached application basically for caching web servers. Works on that port and apparently has some means to get in, perhaps to capture what's been cached. So subtly different than the shell shock situation. Or actually, no, it was the Heartbleed situation. Subtly different. You wouldn't be able to get that to private keys most likely in that case. And then the a sort of a partner port on this one, port 6379, which is associated with the Redis application, which is basically a streaming application, again associated with web server applications. This scanning, as well as actually I'm showing scanning activity here on port 32764 as well, all associated with a single source in China that's been scanning across a number of ports. We've been reporting on this: 5800, 5900, 6379, 7001, 8009, 8090, 8088. 11.2.11, and then 32.764. By the way, 32.764 is associated with a backdoor into some home router activity. So very much indicative of malicious intent here that is defined backdoors or avenues into data or systems that you probably hadn't intended to be there. Next item here is scam probes on 1720 UDP. This is associated with H323. It's used for basically media over the internet, so it could be associated with a voice over IP call control, which is also oftentimes managed through actually port 5060, which is SIP. And in this particular case, it's primarily from a single source in Germany, which also happens to be scanning on port 22.443 and 5060. Again, a clear indicator they're probably looking for SIP gateways or VoIP gateways. Traditionally, this had been popular. Stan, you had done some investigation and looking for gateways that could be potentially used for fraud or toll bypass or toll fraud.
Right. I think a few years ago, a lot of scanning on 56 is SIP-vicious scanning. It was just a lot of it there, and yes, they were looking for all kinds of toll fraud servers that were open that they could use for toll fraud activity and things like that.
Yeah. Now, clearly, just looking at the graph here, we haven't seen a large quantity of this lately. It's been relatively low, but we did see a relatively large spike just today in this activity. We're only looking at, I think this is actually some 60 days of activity here, but it does give a relatively good perspective of what's been going on, which is not terrible, but some really recent activity associated with this. Looking at the top 10 most probed ports, last week the top port was port 22 TCP. This week we're seeing port 23 TCP at the top. So we're going to take a little closer look at that one, followed by port 135 TCP, port 22, that's SSH, 9064, which is a proxy port, 445 TCP. We looked at sort of a long-term history, over the last year or so on port 445. That activity is going down as Conficker is finally kind of withering away. Port 53 UDP, looking for those DNS servers, potentially open DNS resolvers. 1433, Microsoft SQL Database. 3389, Remote Desktop Protocol. Port 1900 UDP, again, that could be used for reflection attacks, so likely probing, looking for those simple service discovery protocol servers. And then last but not least here, 8080 TCP, which is generally associated with proxy service.
That other bucket seems to be getting bigger every week. Is that me or?
Oh, the other bucket? Well, that's a good sign, actually. It's suggestive of other things sort of being more predominant, and spreading out possibly. I guess it depends on how you look at good things. It's a good point. Perhaps what I should do in the future is try to include, how many other ports are involved. That is another statistic that we track. It could suggest more diversity in the ports that are being scanned, and so less of them actually make it into.
So there'll be 65,526 other ports in that?
It'll be it's more like 128,000.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, because
so did you say TCP 23? Isn't that sort of like leaving the front door open? I mean, it's sort of inviting trouble.
It's funny you should mention that, Chet, because there are an awful lot of Internet of things out there, IoT, what I refer to as the unmanaged devices or poorly created devices, ones that really should never attach to the internet, but they're designed or sold for that purpose, that do leave port 23 open. Sometimes they even have an undocumented default password that end users don't realize they need to change, and consequently there are botnets out there that are basically scanning the internet, gathering these, and then using them for denial of service attacks. So a lot of even the stressor services or booter services, denial of service attack that's been capabilities that are commercialized are going out and exploiting these devices and using them for that purpose. At least in somebody that's buying Solaris, I would hope is savvy enough to lock it down, put it in behind a firewall and protect it reasonably well. A lot of these other devices, they're being bought by residential users. They don't know what a port is, let alone what to do to protect it. And a lot of these devices they're firmware. They don't even really have a means for the end user to to correct it, short of knowing that they can log in on Telnet and then go in and then perhaps change some parameters, which will reset once they reboot the device anyway. So.
Yeah, I guess if you're seeing all these port probes for Telnet, and likely you think it's related to sort of Internet of Things type things, whether that's smart fridges and TVs and thermostats and things, it almost suggests we kind of need to evolve our thoughts around our home gateway routers, in that designing them in a way with some sort of a DMZ for your Internet of Things, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, unfortunately, some of these things are in fact the home routers. So.
Well, yeah, exactly. Yeah, we've written about that only too many times.
Yeah. So, but you're absolutely right, and we've got some things going on where we're looking to try to perhaps inspire or motivate some improvements in the ecosystem around IoT devices, and particularly ones that don't fit into the category of what I refer to as managed, and try to get some safety standards around it. So hopefully some more news on that in the future. But take a little closer look at the activity that we're seeing here. We're showing 180 days of activity. It's interesting to see the top graph, which is actually showing the number of probes, and the bottom graph that's showing the number of sources doing those probes. Prior to, say, 30 days ago, you can see, further to the left where there's a really pretty close correlation between the number of sources that are doing the scanning and the number of probes we're seeing on the network. That was very clearly worm-related activity. More devices scanning, more probes. More recently, what we're seeing is a lot of probes, not so many more devices introduced. So that, to me, suggests the possibility of a couple of things. One, perhaps that the scanning activity is in preparation to build a botnet. So we may have another player that's trying to get involved. Or it could be some other sort of motivation. But in any case, they haven't really created that worm capability or the the ability to use many devices in that scanning activity in this particular instance. So it does look like it's a little bit of a different profile than we've seen before. We'll have to see how that evolves going on. But in any case, in terms of the number of sources that have been probing, down relatively speaking. But as we look on the next graph here, the pie chart, port 23 TCP still has the most sources doing the probing activity by far, well in excess of port 445 TCP that we had seen as the predominant leader in the past. And then actually, there really aren't too many others on this particular pie chart. They're really worth mentioning. Just port 1900 UDP, usually that's associated with reflective denial of service attacks themselves, and then port 80 TCP is showing up on there in terms of, and that's not unusual to see a lot of sources probing for port 80.
Speaking of reflective denial of service attacks, there was an article by, I think Akamai put out a report that there's a Microsoft SQL related port 1434.
1434, yes.
Is being used now for UDP reflection. I'm not surprised we didn't see it this week, but I have a feeling that we're probably going to see it in the coming weeks now that it's been getting more press.
That's certainly a possibility. We have been tracking it. It is included in our repertoire of things that we're tracking at this point. And in terms of the size of attacks or even the number of attacks, it's really way down in the noise still. So we have seen, since you brought it up, some more sizable attacks using SNMP compared to previously, but still far and above some of the other parts. The DNS, the character generator, and the NTP are way above in terms of their contributions to these reflective denial of service attacks still today.
Good to know.
So, but it still could develop. I think a lot of folks took their Microsoft SQL databases off the internet when the SQL Slammer worm just completely obliterated a number of systems. Hopefully, the people that are really running those, assuming they're 14 years later, they're still relatively the same people.
Well, that's 14 years of brand new admins who haven't learned that lesson yet, though.
Yeah, it's a good possibility. So we'll have to see how many are really out there and see if that really develops. So good topic to bring up. Thanks, Matt. And that's our show for today. We'd like to thank you for joining us. And if you'd like to get in touch with us, you can reach us at email at threattrack@list.att.com, and you can find ThreatTraq on the AT&T Tech channel. It's att.com/ThreatTraq, and it's also available on YouTube as well as iTunes. And you can follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @ATT Security. So, Chet, thank you for joining us today. Thank you, Matt.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, very much a pleasure. My only disappointment is that you couldn't be here right here in Bedminster with us, but perhaps next time. Thank you, Stan. Thanks, Jim. I thanked you already, right?
We'll say we did.
I'm Brian Rexroad. We'll be back next week with a new episode, and until then, keep your network safe.